Today on the Best of Oklahoma Gardening, we are working on our trees. Certified arborist Brian Eshelman shows how to remove a tree from within the landscape and how to safely notch a tree for directional felling. Kim talks about replenishing the urban forest. We check trees for circling roots, and we do some springtime mulching around our trees. Oklahoma Gardening is a production of the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the land grant mission of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University, dedicated to improving the quality of life of the citizens of Oklahoma through research-based information. Underwriting assistance is provided by TLC, Oklahoma's leading garden center, Southwood Landscape and Nursery, Tulsa's source for great gardens, and the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry, helping to keep Oklahoma green and growing.
Brian Eshelman, certified arborist, is going to demonstrate a safe way to remove a tree from the landscape. And we have this elm tree that has some damage, but we point out there's a few things that can get injured if we drop that tree. There's a Japanese maple and a fence. So how would you approach this tree to take it out safely without damaging anything around it?
Well, I'd trim out the top a little bit, knocking it down, basically topping it out, where we can kind of control the limbs on their way down. We're going to cut through a little way, about halfway through, and we're going to reach out and try to pull it down so that it doesn't fall all in one shot. Then we'll finish the cut at the end. That way we're not, doing any major damage. If we was to drop the whole tree, we could probably drop it this way. However, I think it's going to hit the fence.
Okay.
It may or may not damage the fence. That's why I would come in and kind of knock it down. So if we do, we just barely brush the fence.
Okay.
And that way I can control it. Maybe I can keep it from hitting the fence at all. That's what I'll probably do, is not hit the fence at all.
And when you cut through, you can actually kind of somewhat guide the direction those
if you
limbs are going
if you only cut about halfway through and you leave some of it on there, you can kind of pull it, and that will help you control it more. Some trees are different. This is an elm, so on a pine tree it might break off quicker. Different wood does do different things.
Okay.
But this elm, though, I think we can control it pretty easily.
All right, well, let's take this tree down. Brian, as you were working, I noticed a few other safety precautions you took. Obviously, you were able to take everything down safely from the ground by using a pole saw. We don't want to be reaching over our head with a chainsaw.
Yeah.
And every time you pulled a limb down, you moved it out of your way, removing a trip hazard.
When you're always doing this, you should always be conscious of where you're walking and what you're doing. And there's some rocks here too, so you gotta, you don't want to trip. And especially if you have a sharp object in your hand.
Absolutely.
So pulling, cutting them down, pulling them off, pushing them away. Also, when I was cutting this, You know, we're taking the tree out, so I don't necessarily, it doesn't matter if I peel the bark or not, because it's coming all the way out. If you're taking a limb off at a tree you're going to leave, you want to do what they call a 3-step method. You undercut the limb that you're taking off, and then you cut on the top side.
And that prevents peeling of the bark.
The peeling here that happens.
Okay.
And you leave a little bit of a stub when you do that, and then you come up and you make your finishing cut to cut that stub off. That'll
make a nice smooth cut.
Make a nice smooth cut, because you don't want to leave a big stubs out there either.
So what are you going to do then to take the rest of the trunk out? What's the method you'll take?
I'll just get the chainsaw, and I'll probably put a little notch in the bottom of it and make a back cut. And I kind of want to avoid these plants. It's laying this way. It has no weight on it anymore, but it's still probably, since the lean is pretty good, it's probably going to want to go that way. So I'll probably leave a good hinge on it, and then I'll just push it by hand, because it's so relatively small, just to get it to land in here so we can avoid, you know, less plant damage as we can possibly avoid.
Okay. Well, Brian, I want to thank you for demonstrating safe tree removal for us today, and just, you know, remind our viewers that anything over about 10 inches, we need to be sure to assess the situation, and if it can't be safely removed, to call an arborist for assistance.
Yes, 10 inches I think that's a good scale, but there's also a height issue too, now that I think about it. You know, if it's really tall, really close to something, those are other things to consider.
Always best to be safe.
Yes.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Joining us is Brian Eshelman, a certified arborist with Eshelman Tree Service. And Brian, today I'd like you to demonstrate how to notch the tree when you're felling it, and that's for directing where the tree falls, right?
Yeah. We want the tree to go to a certain area. We have trees, you know, we have cypress over here that we don't want to hit. We have a clear area here. We could drop the whole tree in one shot, and we don't have to top it out. What we do is we put a notch in it, and it's basically flat cut here and an angled cut here. You want it to be about 45 degrees, you know, that's give or take. And then you make a back cut. When you make that back cut, it should be above the bottom cut, the bottom of the notch. It should be above it. If it's below it, you lose control, or you kind of negated the notch altogether. The other thing is, when you're cutting that back cut, you have to leave wood in the middle. You leave wood for a hinge. That's what, if you cut all the way through till you hit the notch, then you got no control, and it'll fall on its own. The other thing, when you're cutting and notching, you need to look at the tree. The lean, is it lean in any way? Is it pretty straight? Where's the weight distributed with the limbs when they come out? This one had one limb coming off the back that we cut off to take some weight off of it. The other thing is, the notch does not, you know, if it's got a severe lean to the back and you make the notch on the back side or the front side, you're not going to overcome gravity.
Okay, so you want a relatively straight tree.
You want a relatively straight tree for notching.
Okay, and in addition to that back limb for weight, you just removed some lower limbs, give you a little head space,
yeah, just
right?
to give me, so I could walk around and not hit my head on anything.
Okay, so let's go through the first step. Just to reiterate, you're going to cut a straight.
You're going to cut a straight cut in here.
About how far?
I want to go. They say about a third of the tree.
Okay.
So we're going to go in roughly a third or so. Sometimes it, you know, varies. We're going to go a third in, and then we're going to come back at the top of the 45 degree angle. I usually do the top one first. Don't really think it matters much which one you do first, as long as they line up. You don't want the You don't want your bottom cut to come past where your other one is, because you've cut into your hinge wood.
Okay.
So you want it to all line up nice and neat.
All right, well, I'll step back and let you work on that. So Brian, you're ready to make the next cut, which is your back cut, and that's the cut that'll drop the tree. Where is that going to go on here?
You want that you're going to start in the back. You want it to be above your notch, an inch. You don't want it, you don't want to be below it, because then you've kind of, like I said again, eliminated the notch. You want to be even is okay, but we'd rather you be above it, so you leave some hinge wood, and you try to be as even as you can when you're coming across with your bar. And you got to keep an eye on the tree at the same time. When you see it starting to go, then you take your escape route.
Okay, and you are going to start kind of exact opposite of where you want the tree to fall.
Yes,
on the back.
yeah,
okay.
Exact opposite from the notch. Before you start your back cut, you want to make sure you have an escape route. Should be a roughly 45-degree angle from the back of the tree. You also want to make sure that's clear, so that you don't trip over anything when you're trying to get away, because the tree is probably going to go the right way, but if unforeseen things happen, you want to make sure you have an escape route to get away from it. This shows a perfect example of the hinge wood, all these torn fibers. That's the wood you want to leave. It can vary in width. The tree, I waited till the tree started to go. I noticed it was raising up before I took the saw out and walked away. But this is a perfect example of leaving the hinge wood. If you cut through this wood, the possibility the tree could go any direction it wants to go.
And your escape route's really important, because when the tree falls, it could bounce up.
The butt could bounce, and it could go different ways. I've seen it bounce away. I've actually seen it bounce and come backwards. So you always want to go away from the stump when it starts to fall, before all that happens.
All right, well, thank you again for showing us the safe methods, and just always reiterate, if you don't feel comfortable doing it, or if it's too big of a tree, that we should always call a professional to help
if you
us
ever
out.
question, that's probably a good sign to hire somebody else.
Thank you, Brian.
Thank you.
As you look around your community, you'll notice we're still losing trees from the back-to-back years of drought in 2011 and 2012. And despite last year's fairly rainy season, much of Oklahoma continues to experience moderate to severe drought conditions. So this year, we can expect to see even more tree mortality. It's more important than ever to plan for the replacement of our urban forest, which is the tree community we see throughout our cities and neighborhoods. As we think about protecting the urban forest, one of the things I consider is actually regeneration or rejuvenation, or the idea of replacing trees as they die out. That might be due to storm damage, as we've seen, or drought, but also age. Trees in Oklahoma tend to not live as long as their counterparts in more mild climates. But even so, trees are very slow growing. Behind me is a ginkgo tree that was planted in 1996. So despite being 20 years old, it's not that big yet. It still has a way to go before it's mature. However, you can imagine if we lost the pine tree next to it, this young tree is already fairly well on its way to replacing that pine tree visually, and also providing the shade that the plantings below need to survive. Here we have another nice example of replacement in the landscape. In the background is an elm tree where previously we had had a hackberry tree, and that hackberry tree unfortunately died, but we already had the river birch and the pecan planted here. So when we lost the shade from that hackberry tree, these trees were already established and able to protect the shade garden below it. And now we've added the elm tree to someday replace these as they age and are lost from the landscape. Another consideration when you're planning for the urban forest is to maintain a diversity of species. I recommend no more than 10% of one species in the landscape, preferably planning for that on a community level. So working with neighborhood associations and educating people on the importance of diversity. And a great example of why that's so important is if we look back to what happened in the early 1900s, we saw entire neighborhoods lose their street tree plantings as Dutch elm disease killed all of the American elms. So to prevent such devastation, that species diversity will ensure that if something does come in and affect one tree species, we still have plenty of other trees to maintain the urban canopy. As you look around our shade garden, you see a nice example of this diversity where we have over 10 different tree species planted. And here we have a very beautiful aesthetic grouping. Now, if you're planning a tree planting project in your neighborhood, you might look to some of the resources offered by the Tree Bank Foundation. They have a variety of programs to support community plantings, providing shade at playgrounds and street plantings. They also have a special program for regenerating neighborhoods that were damaged by tornadoes. So if you're planning to do some tree planting, be sure to visit their website and see how the Tree Bank Foundation can help you. Many landscape trees fail due to problems of girdling roots or circling roots at the soil surface. And this can happen for a number of reasons. The roots, what happens is they develop in a circle instead of growing out away from the plants, and they end up just choking each other out and eventually cutting off the water supply to the plant, killing it. So this can happen, as we have here, in a little perennial, but the same thing happens with our trees, and there's a number of factors that can lead to this. One is when the tree is planted too deep. Remember, we want to see this flare of the tree when the plant is put in the ground. Also, when mulch is piled too high around the base of the plant, the roots will actually end up growing in that nice loose material. So that can be a contributing factor. A lot of times we purchase plants that are already having this problem from the garden center. So it's important to slide trees and even shrubs, pretty much all your plants, out of their container and look at the roots. And if you see the roots growing in a circle in that container, you want to look for a better plant to put in your garden. So sometimes we don't actually cause the problem. We've moved into a landscape where the trees have been there, and even if the problem exists, we can still correct it. One thing I encourage is annually checking, clearing off the soil around the root, around the surface of the tree to get back to the proper level. But about every 3 or 4 years, we want to go ahead and gently dig down until we expose the surface roots. And you can do this with your hands or a small tool, but there's going to be a lot of fine roots up here, so we do want to be careful not to just dig in. So use more of a scraping motion and pull that soil away until we expose the uppermost roots. What we want to find are roots growing out away from the tree rather than growing in a circular motion. Through this excavation, what I was looking for is exposing any shallow roots close to the soil surface, and then also looking for where these larger roots are developing. Ideally, what we would see is all the roots growing out and away from the tree if it was planted properly and the roots were developing well. And I do find a couple of nice roots growing out and away, but there's a couple of challenging roots in here. This one starts here and it grows around, and as we follow it, it actually comes right next to the root ball and continues to grow back behind the plant. So this is a real characteristic of a girdling root, a circling root. Is going to just continue to grow around, and that's one we want to remove. There's another one right here, and it's coming right across the root ball here. If I pull that back a little, you can see it's coming all the way from back here, but when I release it, you can see it's just growing right across that root ball. So that's another one I want to remove. And for small trees and small roots, it's very easy to just come in and clip those out using a hand pruner. If it's a larger root, you might use a lopper. And it's okay if you leave a little piece of the root in there from the other end. Now for a larger tree, you're going to want to consult an arborist. We recently worked with an arborist on a mature oak, a very large oak in our arboretum, and you can see where he cut a very large section of this big root out to prevent any further damage from the circling roots. So large trees I wouldn't tackle myself. I'd get some professional help with those. Now once you've cleaned out any circling roots, you can go ahead and put the soil back. And I want to mention, this is something you're going to do in the morning or on a cloudy, cool day, because these roots are pretty sensitive. You don't want to do this when it's really hot out because they can dry out pretty quickly. So you want to protect those nice shallow and the water feeding roots, those fine fibrous roots. Now as I bring the soil back in here, I felt like it was maybe a little high on this trunk. It was up to about here, kind of at the top of the flare. So I'm gonna bring the soil back more at the base of that flare. And we'll work on maybe removing some of the soil and leveling it out around the tree. So we can check for circling roots on our plants about every 3 to 4 years, but each year when it's time to come in and mulch, it's a great idea to just do a little spring cleanup and pull the mulch and any soil away from the base of the trees until you can see that nice flare. And if you do this every year, you'll be able to just bring a broom in and pull that soil away very easily. This little bit of annual maintenance will ensure a nice healthy tree for years to come. Too often I find mulch piled up against the trunk of trees like this in kind of a volcano-like fashion. Now while mulch has many benefits for trees, it can also cause just as many problems when it's not put down properly. When we have a volcano like this, what happens is this encourages shallow rooting in these upper surface of the mulch, and those roots are very exposed, very sensitive to drought and heat damage. It also causes a really nice environment here around the tree for insects and diseases. It can impede water and air movement to some of the deeper roots and can cause some health issues down there. This environment's also great for mice, which might chew on that stem, the bark of the trunk, and cause some girdling. So whenever we see mulch like this, we want to pull it back away from the tree to expose the base of our tree and that crown area. Now when it's time to mulch, before we go and add more mulch to a landscape, we want to take stock of what's already there. And the best way to do this is to get your rake and move stuff around. Some mulches actually tend to kind of mat up in the garden, and once you rake them, not only will they look a lot better, but you might loosen those mats and find that you have quite a bit of mulch where you thought you didn't have enough. After you've done the raking, what you want to do is come in and see how deep is that mulch layer and kind of pull it back so you can expose the soil. And what you want is a 2 to 4 inch layer. So in this garden, I wouldn't come in and add any more mulch, or if I really wanted to freshen the appearance, just a very little bit across the surface. But in other cases, we might need to add mulch. When additional mulch is needed, we want to add enough to the garden so that the final depth is 2 to 4 inches, including the old mulch and the new mulch. With trees, it's important to mulch all the way to the drip line. That's the furthest extent of the branches. This is particularly important when your tree is surrounded by turf grass. Creating this nice wide mulched area not only keeps lawn maintenance equipment away from your trunk, it also reduces competition between the tree and the grass and provides, of course, all the many benefits of mulch. Now, our tree's in a garden situation, so we're going to have mulch continuous eventually all the way into the garden. Now, when I'm mulching trees, I like the mantra of mulch wide, not deep. And if you look close to the tree, there's not a whole lot of mulch there. I try to put very minimal mulch around the trunk, just enough to cover the soil. And it gets a little bit deeper, about 2 inches as I move out. And I'm using the donut shape, where we have a little bit more mulch out at the edges. This will help move water in towards the trees. We have such limited rain that it's very helpful to get that water to move in and feed our tree, but without having too much mulch there to cause any of those other problems.
Next week, we'll be helping to select plants for the landscape. David Hillock has evergreen shrubs for shady locations and sunny locations. Kim looks at plants for poorly drained soils. We have plants for slopes, shrubs that grow beneath black walnuts, and an ambitious selection of a native grass. Join us then for more of the best TV you'll grow to love. For additional information, show notes, plant lists, recipes, and fact sheets, visit our website or contact your local Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service office. Segments from this episode, along with hundreds more from previous episodes, are available on our YouTube channel, youtube.com/Oklahoma Gardening. Be sure to join our Facebook group for information on upcoming episodes and gardening events, photos, and discussions of gardening topics. Oklahoma Gardening is produced by the Oklahoma Cooperative Extension Service as part of the Division of Agricultural Sciences and Natural Resources at Oklahoma State University. The Botanic Garden at OSU is home to our studio gardens. This outdoor television studio is made possible with the help of our generous underwriters: TLC Garden Centers, Southwood Landscape and Nursery, and the Oklahoma Department of Agriculture, Food, and Forestry. Additional support is provided by Pond Pro Shops, Greenleaf Nursery and the Garden Debut Plants, and the Oklahoma Horticultural Society.